What happens when 8 ordinary people venture too deep into the Appalachian backcountry and return changed, if they return at all? Tonight we bring you true accounts from the oldest mountains in America, where dense forests swallow sound. Forgotten service roads lead to places that prefer remaining untouched, and inherited houses wrought with secrets that previous owners took to graves rather than reveal. From Noah Ellery, who returned to his grandparents' Ridgefield home only to hear something beneath the floorboards calling his name in a voice like mud, to Cohen Reese, who watched Fox Hollows would steal his cousin's voice and use it to lure him into darkness, to Avery Cole, who felt a single finger press against his tent fabric exploring the shape of his leg with horrible curiosity, to Jonah Merritt, who fled his uncle's house in Nolan's Hollow after something tall and dirt-wrapped crossed through shadows that shouldn't permit passage, to Rhett McKay, who found 3 rotting trailers arranged in a circle with skull strings and symbols teaching lessons no human should learn, to Elaine Hart, who discovered what her grandfather kept in the Blue Ridge cellar and why it had no face, to Murrin Vale, who heard breathing behind a boulder all night in Blue Valley Range, and finally to Theo Garner, who found a wire strung with tiny bones around his inherited cabin and learned too late what happens when you ignore warnings written in dead things. These stories reveal that certain places in the Appalachian Mountains remember, certain trails consume, certain voices mimic what you love, and certain warning from men in canvas hats should never be ignored because what lives beneath the kudzu and kudzu choke hollows has been patient for centuries and knows exactly how to make you belong to the mountains rather than simply visiting them. My name is Noah Ellery, and I was 32 years old when I returned to my grandparents' house in Ridgefield after 15 years of avoiding it. 3 nights to empty the place before the estate sale. 3 nights that should have been simple, but instead taught me why I'd spent a decade and a half making excuses not to visit. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that turned to mud in October rains, surrounded by dense Appalachian forests that pressed close on 3 sides like the trees were slowly reclaiming territory humans had temporarily borrowed. My grandparents, Bernard and Estelle, had both passed within months of each other, and as the only grandchild who still lived within driving distance, I'd been voluntold by my mother Ruth to handle the clearing out of 60 years of accumulated possessions. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, the autumn sun already sinking behind the ridgeline and casting the house in premature twilight. The smell hit me the moment I opened the front door, damp wood and rotting leaves, and something else underneath that I couldn't identify but that triggered memories I'd suppressed since childhood. I'd be maybe 7 or 8 the last time I'd stayed overnight here. Some family gathering I barely remembered except for the terror that had kept me awake listening to sound from beneath my bedroom that my grandmother had dismissed as just a house settling, and my grandfather had refused to discuss at all. But standing in that doorway 15 years later with my overnight bag and a box of garbage bags, I felt that childhood fear return with the force of muscle memory my conscious mind had tried to forget. Because the smell wasn't just damp wood and rotting leaves. It was a smell of earth that had been disturbed, of underground spaces that should remain sealed, of things that live where sunlight never reaches. I spent the first evening sorting through the ground floor, boxing up dishes and books, and the accumulated debris of lives lived in one place for 6 decades. The light faded quickly in the hollow where the house sat, darkness arriving earlier here than in the open valleys below, and I found myself frequently looking toward windows that showed nothing but blackness, and occasionally my own reflection staring back with an expression more anxious than I wanted to admit. By 9 p.m., I was exhausted from driving and sorting and the emotional weight of dismantling my grandparents' home, so I headed upstairs to the bedroom that had been mine during childhood visits. That's when I heard it, the scratching, coming from directly below the floorboard beneath my feet, a sound like something dragging claws or fingernails across within a slow, deliberate pattern. I froze on the stays, one hand gripping the banister, listening to the sound move beneath me from the hallway to what would be directly under the kitchen. Not the random skittering of rats or squirrels, but methodical, purposeful, the sound of something that knew I was there and wanted me to know it was there too. What I didn't know in that moment, what I wouldn't discover until much later that first night, was that the scratching was just a beginning, that whatever lived in the crawl space beneath my grandparents' house had been waiting 15 years for someone to come back, and that the trapdoor in the kitchen floor my grandfather had warned me never to open was about to try opening itself from below while I slept upstairs trying to convince myself that houses just settle and animals just scratch, and the Appalachian Mountains don't actually hide things that remember your name and voice from when you were a child terrified of the dark. I tried to convince myself the scratching was just animals as I climbed the rest of the stairs to my childhood bedroom, but my hands were shaking as I set down my bag and checked the window locks twice before finally lying down on the old bed that smelled of mothballs and thyme. Sleep came eventually despite my anxiety, exhaustion overriding fear, and I drifted off to the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional creak of an old house doing what old houses do. But I woke at 2:47 a.m. to a sound that was distinctly not wind or settling wood. It was a slow, rhythmic scraping directly beneath my bed, and then something that sounded horribly like a palm pressing flat against the underside of the floorboards, pushing upward with enough force that I could see the boards flex slightly in the dim light from my phone screen. I sat up slowly, barely breathing, watching the floorboards return to their normal position as whatever was below withdrew its pressure. Then came the voice. Not loud, not even quite a whisper, but somehow carrying through the floor with perfect clarity, a voice like wet earth and rotting leaves, speaking my name. Noah. Noah Ellery. You came back. You came back to the house. We've been waiting. So long waiting. The cadence was wrong. The pronunciation too careful, like something that had learned human speech phonetically without understanding the natural rhythm of how people actually talk. I didn't wait to hear more. Didn't debate whether I was dreaming or hallucinating from exhaustion. I grabbed my phone and my keys and ran downstairs in my socks, taking the steps two at a time while behind me I could hear something moving through the ceiling crawl space above following the sound of my flight. I hit the ground floor and ran toward the front door, but as I passed through the kitchen I saw something that made me stop despite every instinct screaming to keep moving. The trapdoor in the kitchen floor, the one my grandfather had always kept secured with a heavy padlock, was rising. Not quickly, not violently, but slowly and deliberately, like something below was lifting it with careful measured strength. The padlock was still in place, but the entire frame was being pushed upward, screws pulling from old wood, and through the widening gap I could see pale fingers, too long, too thin, joints bending at angles that weren't quite right, gripping the underside of the door. Then I saw what might have been a shoulder or the curve of a back, something large and pale and slick emerging from the crawl space into the kitchen, and I finally broke from my paralysis and ran. I crashed through the front door into the October night, not stopping until I'd reached the tree-lined 50 yards from the house, where I pressed my back against a large oak and stood shaking the cold, watching the house for any sign of movement. Nothing stirred in the windows. No lights came on. The house sat silent and dark exactly as I'd left it, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined everything or if my childhood fears and exhaustion had combined to create hallucinations. But I stayed against that tree through the entire night, watching the sky gradually lighten from black to gray to pale dawn, not trusting myself to go back inside until full daylight made the mundane reality of my grandparents' house reassert itself over whatever nightmare I'd experienced. When I finally returned to the house at 7 a.m., the kitchen trapdoor was perfectly closed and secured with its padlock exactly as it had always been. No signs of disturbance or pulled screws or anything suggesting it had been opened. I gathered what I could reach without going upstairs: a few boxes of my grandmother's china, some photo albums from the living room, items that required no extended time in the house, and loaded them into my car with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I left without going back up to get my bag, without checking any of the upstairs rooms, without even closing the front door properly behind me. The estate sale company could handle the rest. I was done with Ridgefield, done with that house, done pretending that what I'd heard scratching below the floors when I was 7 had been my imagination, or that what called my name in a voice like mud at 2:47 a.m. had been a dream. My name is Cohen Reese, and I was 25 when Fox Hollow took my cousin Mason Pike and left me with the knowledge that certain parts of the Appalachian backcountry don't just disorient hikers or hide dangers. They actively hunt using weapons far more sophisticated than teeth or claws. Mason was 28, a skeptic who'd spent our entire childhood dismissing my stories about strange things in the mountains as superstition and ignorance, who'd moved to Charlotte and adopted the city dweller's conviction that wilderness was just scenery without consciousness or intent. When I suggested a 3-day backpacking trip through some of the more remote areas near Fox Hollow, Mason had agreed with the confidence of someone who'd read survival guides and watched YouTube tutorials and thought that knowledge translated to actual preparedness for what the deep woods could contain. We started on a Thursday morning in late September, leaving my truck at a Forest Service parking area and hiking into terrain that got progressively less maintained with each mile. The official trails gave way to old logging roads, which gave way to service roads barely visible under years of leaf litter. which finally gave way to paths that seemed to exist more from animal traffic than human use. We passed stone chimneys standing alone where houses had rotted away decades ago, rusted car frames being slowly consumed by kudzu hand-painted signs so faded the words were barely legible, but which seemed to say things like "no return trail" and "private" keep out in letters that suggested they'd been warnings rather than property markers. On the second day, as we climbed a steep ridge line through dense hardwoods, I saw it for the first time, a figure standing motionless about 50 yards up so partially obscured by trees. Tall, maybe 7 feet if it was standing upright, with arms that hung too long and a head that seemed to can at an angle that wasn't quite right. I stopped walking and grabbed Mason's arm, pointing silently. He looked, squinted, and after a moment shrugged. Dead tree with branches. You're seeing shapes because you're tired. But I'd grown up in these mountains, and I knew the difference between dead trees and things that watched with purpose and patience. That night we camped in a small clearing beside a creek that ran so slow and quiet it barely made sound against the rocks. As darkness fell, we heard the whippoorwills start their evening calls, dozens of them creating that distinctive 3-note song that sounds like they're saying their own name. But around 11 p.m., as Mason and I were settling into our tents, the whippoorwills stopped. All of them. Simultaneously, the forest plunged into a silence so complete it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums like being underwater. And then, from somewhere in the trees beyond our firelight, I heard my mother's voice calling my name. "Cohen? Cohen? Baby, where are you? I can't find you in the dark. Come help Mama. Cohen." My mother had been dead for 3 years, killed in a car accident on Route 23, and her voice was burned into my memory with a clarity that comes from grief. This wasn't a bad imitation or a vague similarity. This was her exact voice, her exact inflection, the exact way she called for me when I was a child and had wandered too far from the house. I felt my body moving toward the sound before my conscious mind could override the instinct to respond to a mother calling her son, and only Mason's hand grabbing my shoulder stopped me from walking into the darkness beyond our camp. "That's not your mom," Mason whispered, his skepticism finally cracking as he heard something that shouldn't exist using a dead woman's voice to lure her son into the woods. "Whatever that is, it's not her. Stay in the tent. Stay in the light." But the voice kept calling, kept pleading, kept using my mother's exact words and cadence, and I had to press my hands over my ears and recite multiplication tables to keep from responding to the fundamental human need to help your mother when she sounds scared and lost in the dark. By 1 a.m., the voice that sounded like my mother had been joined by other voices. Mason's voice calling for me from somewhere in the woods saying, "Cohen, I found something. You need to see this." And then my own voice responding to Mason's voice, having a conversation I wasn't actually having. Both of us apparently standing somewhere beyond the firelight discussing whether to investigate a sound we'd heard. Mason and I sat in his tent with our headlamps on, looking at each other while our voices had a full conversation maybe 30 yards away in the darkness, mimicking our speech patterns and vocabulary with horrible accuracy. Around 2 a.m., I made the mistake of looking out through the tent's mesh window, and what I saw made my blood freeze despite the rational part of my brain trying to find explanations that didn't involve the supernatural. The clearing where we'd pitched our tents, just 2 of them, mine and Mason's, now appeared to hold 5 or 6 tents arranged in a circle around our dead fire. But these tents weren't quite right. They had the shape and structure of camping tents, but they seemed to be made of something that looked organic rather than synthetic, material that might have been hide or skin stretched over frames, and they glowed faintly with foxfire bioluminescence like rotting wood in summer. Mason saw them too, confirming I wasn't hallucinating, and we made a decision to abandon our gear and run for the service road we'd passed maybe 2 miles back. We exited Mason's tent together, grabbed our packs with our emergency supplies and water, and started moving quickly through the woods using our headlamps to navigate. Behind us I could hear our voices still calling to each other, still having conversations we weren't having, and then I heard something worse. Footsteps following us through the leaf litter, multiple sets of footsteps, bare feet by the sound of them moving with the confidence of things that knew this terrain far better than we did. I glanced back once and immediately wished I hadn't. The headlamp beam caught figures moving between trees, pale, thin, tall like the thing I'd seen on the ridge, moving with a gliding motion that suggested they weren't quite walking the way humans walk. Their faces, if they had faces, were in shadow or perhaps just featureless, and they moved with a purpose that suggested they were herding us rather than chasing us, guiding our flight towards something rather than simply pursuing for the sake of catching. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 minutes, crashing through undergrowth and splashing through streams, until finally we burst out onto a gravel service road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, but at least represented human infrastructure and civilization. A Forest Service truck was parked maybe 50 yards down the road, and a ranger named Dale Hoffman was checking a gate lock when he heard us emerge from the woods. "You boys okay?" he called out, immediately recognizing the signs of people who'd encountered something in the backcountry that had scared them badly enough to abandon gear and flee. I tried to explain what we'd experienced, the voices, the extra tent, the figures following us, but even as I spoke I could hear how insane it sounded, could see the skepticism on Dale's face despite his professional courtesy in listening to my story. "Let me drive you back to the parking area," he said finally. "Fox Hollow's got a reputation. A lot of folks get disoriented in there, hear things that aren't there. The acoustics do weird stuff with sound, makes voices carry an echo in ways that can seem like mimicry." His explanation was reasonable and logical and didn't account for any of what we'd actually experienced, but I was grateful for the ride in the company of another human who wasn't being imitated by something in the woods. We drove back to the Forest Service parking area where I'd left my truck 2 days earlier, Dale following behind us in his vehicle to make sure we got out safely. As I was unlocking my truck, I realized Mason wasn't beside me anymore. I turned around and he was standing at the tree line about 20 feet away, his back to me, completely still. "Mason," I called. "Come on, man, let's go." He didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there facing the woods with his arms hanging at his sides in a posture that looked wrong somehow, too loose and relaxed. Dale approached him cautiously, calling his name, and when he got close enough to touch Mason's shoulder, the figure turned around, and I saw Mason's face, but his eyes were completely black, pupils dilated to the point where no iris was visible. And when he opened his mouth, the voice that came out was Mason's voice, but the words were, "He belongs to the Hollow now." He answered when we called. "You didn't. You can leave." Then Mason turned and walked back into the woods, moving with that same gliding motion I'd seen from the pale figures the night before. And when Dale tried to follow him, he simply vanished between two trees like he'd stepped through a door that closed behind him. My name is Avery Cole, and I was 38 when grief drove me into the Appalachian backcountry for a week of solitary camping that nearly became permanent when something at Jasper Bend decided to study me with the curiosity of a child examining an insect under glass. I'd lost my partner David to cancer 6 months earlier, and the well-meaning advice about grief support groups and therapy and giving myself time to heal had started to feel suffocating rather than helpful. I needed silence and distance from people who wanted to fix me or comfort me or understand what I was experiencing. The mountains offer that silence, or so I thought until I learned that silence in the deep woods isn't absence of sound but presence of attention. I hiked into Jasper Bend on a Wednesday in early October, carrying enough supplies for 5 days and following a trail that started maintained but rapidly deteriorated into something barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. The bend itself was a curve in a shallow river where water moved so slowly over smooth rocks that it barely made sound, surrounded by old-growth trees that created a canopy dense enough to keep the ground in perpetual twilight even at noon. I set up my tent on a flat area maybe 15 feet from the water, built a fire ring from river stones, and spent the first day just sitting and watching light filter through leaves and trying not to think about David or the empty house waiting for me back in civilization. The footprints appeared on the second day. I'd walked down to the river's edge to filter water and noticed them in the soft mud of the bank, elongated marks that looked almost like bare footprint but stretched and narrow, the stride length suggesting whatever made them had been moving in long bounds rather than normal walking steps. The prints led from upstream, circled my tent in a spiral pattern that got progressively tighter, and then led back to the water where they disappeared as if whatever made them had entered the river and either swum away or simply ceased to exist. That night I lay in my tent listening to normal forest sounds, insects, the occasional splash of a fish or frog in the river, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and tried to convince myself the footprints were from some animal I wasn't familiar with, or that the spiral pattern was coincidence rather than deliberate examination of my campsite. Around midnight I heard a new sound, a two-note whistle that started distant and gradually got closer, repeating the same two tones over and over with mechanical precision. Then the sound stopped directly outside my tent, and silence returned, broken only by my own breathing and heartbeat. I don't know how long I lay there frozen before I felt it, a single finger pressing against the outside of the tent fabric directly over my bent knee. Not pushing hard, not aggressive, just pressing gently and then moving slowly down my shin, tracing the shape of my leg through the tent material with what felt like genuine curiosity. The finger moved with deliberate slowness, exploring the contours of my knee joint, moving to my calf, pausing at my ankle, then traveling back up to my thigh where it pressed slightly harder as if testing the density of muscle beneath fabric and skin. I couldn't see anything through the tent. Whatever was on the other side wasn't casting a shadow against the moonlight or creating any visual presence, but I could feel that single finger exploring my leg with the curiosity of something that had never encountered human anatomy before and found it fascinating. The exploration lasted maybe 5 minutes that felt like hours before the pressure finally withdrew, and I heard what might have been footsteps moving away from the tent toward the river, or might have been just the wind shifting leaves. I couldn't tell anymore because every sound had taken on sinister potential, and my ability to distinguish normal from abnormal had been completely compromised by fear and the violation of being touched through the tent by something I couldn't see or identify. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Just lay rigid in my sleeping bag with my knife in one hand and my headlamp in the other, listening for any sound that might indicate the return of whatever had touched my leg. Dawn came slowly, gray light gradually filtering through the tent fabric, and when I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and look outside, I found no footprints anywhere near where I'd felt the finger pressing through fabric. The mud around my tent was undisturbed except for my own boot prints from the previous day. No elongated tracks, no spiral patterns. No evidence anyone or anything had been there except the memory of that gentle exploratory pressure moving along my leg. I should have packed up immediately and hiked out, but in daylight with birds singing and the river sparkling in morning sun, the fear from the night before felt like it might have been nightmare or imagination or the result of grief and isolation playing tricks on my mind. I decided to stay one more night, to prove to myself I could handle solitude without descending into paranoid terror of every unexplained sound. I spent the day gathering more firewood than I needed, building the fire up higher than was reasonable, creating a barrier of light and smoke and human activity that felt like protection, even though rationally I knew fire wouldn't deter anything that had been bold enough to approach my tent and touch me through the fabric. As afternoon faded toward evening, I took a final walk upstream to filter more water for the night, following the river's edge past a small waterfall and around a boulder pile. That's when I saw the tree, a young sycamore with pale bark that made carving visible even from a distance. Someone or something had carved a symbol into the trunk at about eye level for me, cut deep enough that the exposed wood was several shades darker than the bark. The symbol was simple, a humanoid silhouette with an elongated body, no arms, and a round head with no features. Beneath the figure was what might have been a representation of water with wavy lines, and below that a single word carved in letters that looked like they'd been made with a knife or claw, watched. The carving was fresh, sap still weeping from the deepest cuts, with exposed showing it had been done recently, probably within the last 24 hours. Probably while I'd been at my campsite, thinking I was alone in this part of the forest. Someone or something had been close enough to carve this message into a tree maybe 100 yards from where I'd slept, and they'd chosen to carve a figure that looked uncomfortably similar to what I'd imagined based on the feel of that single exploring finger, tall, armless, feature-less. I didn't return to camp at a walk. I ran, splashing through the shallow river rather than following the bank, not caring about wet boots or dignity or anything except getting back to my tent and packing out immediately while there was still daylight. I threw everything into my pack with no organization or care, kicked dirt over the fire that was barely started, and began hiking out on the trail I'd come in on 3 days earlier. My pack wasn't properly secured and items kept shifting and digging into my back, but I didn't stop to adjust anything until I'd put at least 2 miles between myself and Jasper Bend. When I finally did stop to catch my breath and reorganize my gear, I found something in the outside pocket of my pack that I absolutely had not put there, a piece of bark about the size of my palm with the same armless figure carved into it, the carving so fresh that wood shavings still clung to the grooves. This piece of bark had not been in my pack when I'd started packing up. This had been placed there while I was running away or while my pack was sitting on the ground during my brief panic to break camp. Something had been close enough to my belongings to leave a token or a warning or a souvenir, and I hadn't seen or heard anything that would indicate another presence. I hiked out the remaining 4 miles of the trailhead in record time despite exhaustion and fear, and when I reached my car I threw the pack in the trunk without unpacking it properly, drove straight home without stopping, and stood in my shower for nearly an hour trying to wash away the feeling of being studded and marked by something that lived in the woods around Jasper Bend. The piece of bark stayed in my pack pocket for weeks because I couldn't bring myself to touch it again, and eventually I threw the entire pack away rather than remove the card bark and have to hold it in my hands. David had been dead 6 months when I went into those mountains seeking solitude and silence, and what I found instead was the knowledge that true isolation doesn't exist in the Appalachian backcountry because something is always watching, always curious, always willing to reach out through tent fabric to explore the shape of your Lego leaf carved token to remind you that wilderness doesn't mean empty and silence doesn't mean alone. My name is Jonah Merritt, and I was 27 when my uncle Silas passed away and left me his house in Nolan's Hollow, a property I'd visited exactly once as a child, and had vague memories of as being dark and cold and somehow wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The will specified I had to stay in the house for at least one night to claim ownership. Some quirk of Appalachian property law, or maybe just my uncle's strange sense of humor. So I drove down from Pennsylvania on a Saturday in November intending to stay overnight, sign whatever paperwork the estate law required, and list the place for sale immediately without any sentimental attachment to a building I'd never liked. Nolan's Hollow was barely a hollow at all, more like a depression between two ridge lines where a handful of houses had been built decades ago and most had since been abandoned or fallen into disrepair. Uncle Silas's house was the last one still technically inhabited before he died, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and a porch that sagged dangerously on one end. The interior smelled of mildew and old smoke, furniture covered in dust, wallpaper peeling in long strips that hung like dead skin. I spent the afternoon opening windows to air the place out and making a list of everything that would need to be done before the house could be shown to potential buyers. The knocking started around 7 p.m., just after sunset when the hollow filled with shadows that seemed thicker and darker than normal twilight should produce. 3 polite knocks on the front door, the kind of knock a neighbor might make when stopping by to borrow sugar or deliver mail. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing, just the empty porch and the woods beyond turning black as night settled in. I opened the door cautiously, stepping out onto the porch to look around, but there was no one visible anywhere near the house. I went back inside, dismissing it as a branch hitting the door and wind or some other natural sound I'd misinterpreted. 20 minutes later it came again. 3 polite knocks, same rhythm, same location on the door. This time I opened the door immediately without looking through the peephole first, fast enough that anyone standing there wouldn't have time to hide. But again the porch was empty. I stood in the doorway looking out into darkness and suddenly became aware of how isolated this house was, how far from the main road, how many trees surrounded it on all sides, creating a barrier between me and any potential help. The footsteps upstairs started around 9 p.m. I was sitting in the living room with all the lights on trying to read property documents when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking across the floor directly above me. Not shuffling or creaking boards settling, deliberate footsteps moving from one side of the upstairs hallway to the other, pausing, then walking back. I grabbed the tire iron I brought from my car and climbed the stairs slowly, checking each room on the second floor and finding them all empty and undisturbed. But the moment I came back downstairs, the footsteps started again. Same pattern, same deliberate pacing like something was waiting for me to leave before resuming its patrol of the upper floor. Around 11 p.m. I heard the whisper. I'd been trying to ignore the footsteps and convince myself to just lock myself in the ground floor bathroom for the night and leave at first light, when I heard someone speaking in a language I didn't recognize from just outside my uncle's bedroom door. The words were rhythmic, almost chant-like, consonants that clicked and vowels that seemed too long, and underneath the words I could hear what sounded like breathing that wasn't quite human, too deep, too slow, with a wet quality that suggested damaged lungs or something that lived in damp places and wasn't designed for air. I stood frozen in the hallway listening to the whispered chanting from beyond my uncle's bedroom door, every survival instinct I possessed screaming contradictory advice. Run immediately versus investigate to know what you're dealing with versus hide and wait for dawn. The decision was made for me when the bedroom door began to open slowly on hinges that squealed with rust and disuse. I saw a sliver of the dark room beyond, then a wider gap, and then standing in the doorway was something tall and roughly humanoid in shape but wrapped or coated in what looked like dark earth or mud, clumps of it falling away as the figure moved to reveal pale skin or fabric underneath. I couldn't tell which and didn't want to know. The figgy's head turned toward me with a motion that was too smooth, like it was rotating on a mechanism rather than a neck with bones and muscles, and I finally broke from my paralysis and ran. I didn't go for the front door. Some instinct told me that was too obvious, that the thing would anticipate that route. So I crashed through the kitchen and out the back door into the November night wearing just jeans and a t-shirt with no shoes and no phone, and no plan except to put distance between myself and whatever had been whispering in that bedroom. I ran through woods in total darkness, branches whipping my face and arms, roots catching my bare feet and making me stumble and fall and get back up and keep running. Behind me I could hear something moving through the underbrush, not crashing loudly but moving with steady purpose, maintaining consistent distance that suggested it was pacing me rather than pursuing at full speed. I reached a dirt road, barely more than a path but enough to give me a sense of direction, and followed it downhill toward where I hoped the main highway would eventually connect. After maybe 20 minutes of running, I saw house lights in the distance and nearly sobbed with relief. I pounded on the door of the first lit house I reached, a small trailer with a pickup truck parked outside, and a man named Earl Patterson answered holding a shotgun and looking ready to use it until he saw my condition, barefoot, bleeding from scratches and cuts, gasping for breath and clearly terrified. "What the hell happened to you?" he demanded. I tried to explain about my uncle's house and the thing I'd seen in the bedroom, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. Earl let me use his phone to call a tow truck for my car which I'd abandoned at the house, and I spent the rest of the night sitting in his living room drinking coffee and trying to stop shaking. At dawn, Earl drove me back to retrieve my car, his shotgun across his lap and his expression suggesting he thought I might be crazy or on drugs but was willing to help anyway. We pulled up to my uncle's house and everything looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived the previous afternoon. Door closed, windows intact, no signs of disturbance or anything unusual. My car was where I'd left it. The house sat silent in morning light, looking like any other old abandoned property in the Appalachian foothills. Earl waited while I got in my car and started the engine, and I could see in his face that he thought I'd hallucinated or overreacted to normal sounds in an old house at night. I never went back to Nolan's Hollow. I signed papers giving up any claim to the property, not caring about the potential value or the money I was leaving on the table. The estate lawyer was confused but didn't argue when I insisted she sell to anyone who wanted it and send me whatever pittance remained after fees and back taxes were paid. 2 months later, she called to tell me the house had burned down, electrical fire they suspected, and the lot would be sold for the land value. I felt nothing but relief that whatever had been in my uncle's house was gone, though sometimes late at night I wondered if the fire was really electrical or if someone else had tried to stay there overnight and had the same experience I did and had decided to solve the problem with gasoline and matches rather than running away like I had.